John spends almost 25% of his entire gospel talking about the Last Supper, this last few hours in the life of Jesus. And perhaps John is maybe the most mystical of the four canonical gospels, and obviously then the most misunderstood frequently, particularly by the churches. So churches and religion very often have this penchant for turning mysticism into dogma. And so this passage I've taken today, it needs to be heard through mystical lenses, not through your intellect and not through the dogmatic assertions of the church. Because in it, Jesus is not talking about his own uniqueness, how he's different from everybody, but how he is the prototype. So in some senses, if I were to give this homily today a title, I would say it is Jesus as a fractal of the past and as a prototype for the future. So what Jesus is saying today is a message about the divinity in every single one of us, not just his own divinity. So he goes off script. He's been following, presumably, the Seder script during the Last Supper, but now he's off script and he's praying directly to God, as people listen to him. And here was his prayer. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one, as we are one. I in them, and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me, and have loved them even as you have loved me. Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am, and to see my glory, the glory you gave me because you loved me before the creation of the world. Righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them, and will continue to make you known, in order that the love you have for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them. These are words inspired by God. So yesterday, during my meditation, when I was thinking about the homily for today, which is kind of a recap of the last 2 weeks, I had an image of a support group meeting. I'm sure you've all heard about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an ancient syndrome. People who've had experienced either a single traumatic event or an ongoing series of events. And it's really traumatizing because it leads to non-stop kind of nightmares and anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation. And presumably it's been part of the human experience almost since the beginning, since the arrival of Homo sapiens sapiens many thousands of years ago. But I had this image that I was sitting in on a support group for PTSD people, except that it was multi-generational and it was time-lapsed. And like all kind of 12-step programs, people just introduced themselves by their first name. And so here's what I heard in my meditation. The first person, a woman, said, "Hi, my name is Immaculée. I'm a Tutsi. I survived the Rwanda Holocaust in 1994. And then the next guy said, "Hi, my name is Jim. I'm an American. I survived 3 tours in Vietnam." And the third person said, "Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a Jewess. I survived 3 years in Auschwitz." And the fourth guy said, "Hi, my name is Tommy. I'm a Brit. I survived the Normandy invasion in June of 1944. And then the fifth one said, "Hi, my name is Kurt. I'm a German. I survived the Battle of the Somme in June of 1916. And then the final person in the group said, "Hi, my name is Jesus. I'm a Jew. I survived crucifixion and 3 days in hell in 30 CE. Now, obviously, I don't have the time to tell the stories of Immaculate and Jim and Rebecca and Tommy and Kurt. So I'll focus today just on the story of the last week in the life of Jesus. And it'll be a recap of the last 2 homilies I did, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So what you're hearing today then is a kind of a very brief synopsis of what I've spoken about the last 2 weeks. So I started off 2 weeks ago looking at the last week from Palm Sunday through Good Friday. And about Palm Sunday, I made the remark about the huge discrepancy kind of from the sublime to the ridiculous, that Pilate, or the Roman governor in Israel, every year, he was based in Caesarea Philippi, which was on the kind of the shores of the Mediterranean. But he would march in through the western gate of Jerusalem on his war charger with thousands of troops in attendance to kind of just quell the crowd. At the very same time that he's coming in on his war charger with his weaponry and his soldiers, Jesus is coming through the eastern gate of Jerusalem on a donkey. So I talk about this image from the sublime to the ridiculous. And the reason that Pilate, or the Roman governor, would come in during the Passover festival was that the Jews were celebrating the exodus from Egypt around 1250 BCE. And the population of Jerusalem would swell from about 40,000 people, which was typical, to about 1.5 million people during this week of festivities. And so the Romans were always very, very skittish that there would be some kind of a revolt. So Pilate would take up occupancy of the Fortress Antonia, which was directly overlooking the temple courtyard to keep an eye on the rest of Jews. And so there was the kind of the contrast between Pilate on his war charger and Jesus on his donkey. Almost immediately after, you find the story of Jesus clearing the temple. Now, when I think about what clearing the temple meant, I don't just see him upscuttling the tables of the money changers. I see him having a big issue with the whole notion of animal sacrifice. You just imagine that the people would have to sacrifice an animal during this period of time. And so you would literally get tens of thousands of animals screaming, and the blood and the offal and the stench and the flies from the constant butchering. So I think Jesus was taking a stance against this notion as well. And he was taking a stance against this kind of money laundering that was going on in the temple, because the denarii was the coin of the realm for Romans. So all business was done with the denarii. But you couldn't buy something in the temple with a denarii because it wasn't kosher. And so you had to change your denarii for shekels, which was the coinage of Judaism. And so there were these people in the temple who were changing one kind of coin for the other. And this was necessary because you couldn't buy an animal and sacrifice it by paying for it in denarii. That would not be kosher. And so you got this total kind of a mishigas going on. And Jesus is now trying to, in my opinion, symbolically liberate spirituality from mere man-made religions. He's trying to move from legalism to love. He's trying to move from violence and sacrifice to forgiveness. And he's trying to move from a punitive God who demands sacrifice to a gentle Abba. And certainly, again and again and again, in Christian history, there have been other great mystics attempting to do the very, very same thing that Jesus did way back then, because certainly the Christian churches were more than corrupt in their times. We have St. Francis attempting to do it around the year 1200. We have Luther attempting to do it in 1517. Then you have Vatican II attempting to do it in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Well, only time will tell whether that was successful or not. So that's basically what I said about the clearing of the temple. For me, that's symbolically what Jesus was attempting to do. I then spoke about Holy Thursday and the Seder meal, the Passover meal, and the ridiculous notion that this was a Seder meal conducted by, for, and with only men. That makes absolutely zero sense, that a Seder meal would have no women present. And so it's like having a Christmas celebration for a family or a Thanksgiving celebration for a family and excluding all of the women from it. And the reason for me is obvious, because at the Last Supper, Jesus ordained everybody who was present when he said, do this in memory of me. And so he's ordaining, in some senses, everybody who was present. So you got to get the women out of the room immediately, because you can't have women priests. I believe that at that final meal, that basically Christ instituted three kinds of sacraments, three different sacraments. And the first one was Eucharist, where he took the Seder meal and he transformed it radically. And he gave us an image which is a radically feminine image by saying, feeding us from his own body and blood, saying, this is my body, take it and eat it. This is my blood, take it and drink it. So I can't think of any more beautiful symbol of the feminine face of God than Eucharist. So in some senses, it's God feeding us from her own body and her own blood, just as a mother does. So first the mother conceives the child, then she carries it, she nurtures it internally, then she births it, and then she feeds it from her breast. And the very, very same thing Christ is saying, that is the mission, of a true mystic, is to conceive us, to conceive love for the human family, to carry it, to give birth to it, and to feed it in whatever way he can. And I suggested that there's a code, I call it a Eucharistic code. And when you come across it any place in the New Testament, there's a Eucharistic encounter taking place. And the code words are, he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. So to take means to lovingly accept from Pachamama everything we wear, everything we eat, every house we build, it's given us by our mother, Gaia herself. So we have to take it with gratitude. The second thing is to bless. And bless is not the imparting of a benediction to a previously inert substance. It's the recognition of the inherent sanctity of everything we receive from Pachamama. So that's what blessing means for me. And then he broke it. This is to form the intention of sharing with those who don't have. And then finally distributed. That is kind of the network of making sure that everybody gets their needs met. So when I think of the sacrament of Eucharist, I'm not just thinking about a liturgy that we perform on Sundays. I'm thinking about the sociological and the political and the financial ramifications of what it means to celebrate a Eucharist. The second sacrament he created then was priesthood, I believe. And he priested everybody who was present. And I keep saying to us every Sunday during Mass that every single one of us is a priest. We are priests by virtue of incarnation. That was our ordination rite. And therefore, we must take our priesthood very, very seriously. We must be ministers of Christ to the world. And the third sacrament, which is not regarded by the church as a sacrament, I call it the sacrament of service, the washing of the feet, where Jesus washes the feet of everybody present. Now, in fairness, throughout Christian history, there have been really some extraordinary efforts at celebrating this sacrament of service. Education in Europe was created by the nuns and the monks. Healing services, the hospital system, the hospice system, even agriculture was basically created by the monks in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. So in fairness, we've had this great ability to take this sacrament of service into the world, and we still see around us that Christian people involved in all kinds of service to those who are in all kinds of need. So that was the beginning of Holy Thursday. And then it ended with the agony in the garden, what I've called the mother of all panic attacks. A panic attack is so severe, it was like a psyops by Satan to persuade Jesus that he'd been duped and abandoned by the Father. And so it's so intense that he sweats blood. And finally, he's captured in the garden. And even at that moment, in the depths of his own despair, he's looking out for his own. He's protecting his own. The people in the garden with him, even as they abandon him and deny him and even betray him for 30 pieces of silver. What he says to the soldiers were, if you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, I am he. Let these people go. They're not involved in this. And so that was the end of his Holy Thursday. And then it's followed by the Good Friday, 4 kind of kangaroo courts, where firstly, he's taken in front of the high priest and accused of blasphemy, and then taken in front of Pilate, and Pilate washes his hands and sends him to Herod, for who's in Jesus' jurisdiction in Galilee, and Herod is expecting to see some miracles, and he finds that Jesus is just a total fool. And Herod is the only person in Scripture whom Jesus encounters, with whom Jesus share even a single word. So Herod sends this fool back to Pilate, and finally Pilate is told, okay, crucify him. And I rearranged from the 4 gospel accounts the 7 last phrases of Jesus. And I put them in a chronology, which I think reflects the movement of Jesus, from a fixation on his own suffering, to looking at the suffering of his family, to looking at the suffering of the criminals who are being executed with him, to looking at his persecutors, and then finally being ready to go back to the Father. And so his own personal suffering is represented by the phrase, I thirst. So this is just symbolic of the excruciating agony that he was experiencing hanging on this gibbet. The second one is he feels psychologically abandoned by the Father. And he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? The third one, he now begins to realize he sees his mother and John the Beloved and Mary of Magdala, and he's just trying to imagine what they must be suffering. So now he's trying to make provision for them so that they look out for each other when he's dead. So nodding at his mother, he says, woman, behold your son. And look to John, and son, behold your mother. And we're told in the gospel that from that day on, John took Mary into his own home, and protected her throughout the rest of her life. The fourth one is one of the thieves, turns to him and says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And now Christ is focused on the suffering, of somebody who's been crucified with him. And he says to him, truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Not at the last judgment. Today you will be with me in paradise. And then he looks at the soldiers who are mocking him and dividing his garments. And he says, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. And at this stage, he's able to say, okay, I've completed the mission for which I volunteered for incarnation. Father, into your hands, I now commend my spirit. In other words, Baba, hug me. But there's one other piece that I take from the Apostles' Creed, which was created in the 3rd century. This notion that, while Jesus was in the tomb after being crucified, he's buried in the tomb, we're told he descended into hell. And for me, this represents the fact that Jesus was trying to bring light into the darkest, deepest, densest sense of separation from source. That whoever is ultimately separated, who don't even know of the existence of God, don't know of the existence of light, that he's coming down to bring light, to infuse the light of Christ consciousness into the darkest, deepest, densest separation. It's like what Buddhism will call the hungry ghosts, or a New Age would call the lower astral realm, the place where discombobulated souls who haven't yet found their way back to the light are casting about in their pain and in their anguish. He went down to shed light even into that piece. So that's where I went 2 weeks ago. Then last week, I picked up on the Easter Sunday and my own understanding of it. And the realization that English is a very, very poor language actually for treating mystical concepts. So for instance, we have this notion of a body, that the body is just physical, 150 pounds of, endocrine system and immune system and elimination system, cardiovascular systems, a few organs like a brain and a heart and a liver and a kidney. Whereas other groups have a much more sophisticated notion, and particularly the Greeks, and the New Testament is written in Greek. Greeks had 3 words for body: sarx, which was this stuff, flesh and blood, and soma, which is kind of the etheric blueprint, of which the physical body is just a printout, and then pneuma, or spirit body. And as I pointed out, in Paul's letter his first letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 11 and in chapter 15, where he's talking about Eucharist and talking about resurrection, he says, sarx cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. Flesh and blood cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. So when you're talking about both Eucharist and resurrection, we are not talking about sarx. So when we're talking about the resurrected body, or consuming Jesus in Eucharist, we have to understand what we're meaning. We're not biting into Jesus' liver or his kidneys when you receive Holy Communion. And you have to understand the same thing is true of the resurrection stories. And I mentioned particularly that Hinduism has even a more sophisticated model with 7 different levels of body: the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, the mental body, the psychic body, the soul body, and finally the cosmic body. And so we have to understand these notions of body in order to be able to grok the notion of resurrection and the notion of Eucharist. And I used a few different metaphors in dealing with this. I talked about this great novel in the 1800s by a guy called Abbott of Flatland, of a 3-dimensional sphere interacting with a 2-dimensional piece of paper and trying to persuade the denizens of the 2 dimensions, straight lines and squares and circles and ellipses, that there's a 3rd dimension, and the notion of quantum tunneling in quantum mechanics, that sometimes when particles meet, they can actually pass through each other. So depending upon the density of the of one object and the kinetic energy of the other. And so quantum tunneling is where they can pass through each other, you know, and I'm thinking that that's possibly what Jesus is doing when he appears in the upper room to the disciples. And I took the Greek verb, which is translated into English as to appear, that he appeared to the disciples. And to show you that to appear does not mean that if Jesus came into the room, everybody looking, you know, at the same location would see him. It means that he chose to make himself visible to. So to put in an appearance, he chose to make himself visible to. So it's not where you look, it's how you look. So if you're looking just merely with the sensorium, you're not going to have an encounter. It's interesting to me that the great appearances of Jesus after his resurrection all had to do with meals, having to do with some kind of a ritualistic meal, some kind of a symbolism that alters your state of consciousness, so you're looking with different eyes and then can see the resurrected Christ. And I played around with a few metaphors, like a story of, if I had a friend visiting from, Bob Dunges is visiting me from Oklahoma, and he's staying in a hotel in Palo Alto on the 5th floor. And he phones me and says, any chance you could come down to Palo Alto and we could have a meal together? And so I drive down to Palo Alto, and parking lot is 3 stories underground, and Bob is on the 5th floor, and the hotel, the restaurant is in the lobby. Bob is going to have to go down several floors, and I'm going to have to come up several floors in order for us to meet. That's what resurrection is about. It's about a change in frequencies of both parties in order to make an encounter possible. And I use the example of, I suggest that if you didn't know flora, if you had no knowledge of flora and plant life, you could never infer the possibility of a golden daffodil from this ugly bulb out of which it manifested. Nor could you infer, you know, a majestic oak tree from the presence of a tiny acorn. And by the same token, without a mystical sense, you could never infer the reality of spirit from the presence of mere matter. Nor could you infer the existence of a soul from the experience merely of an ego. And so trying to measure the reality of resurrection by using the sensorium is like trying to measure your IQ with a weighing scale. It ain't going to work. So that's what I talked about, you know, some metaphors. And I talked about this notion I have of 2 different crosses. I call them the cross of crucifixion and the cross of resurrection. And the cross of crucifixion for me is not an instrument of torture. Basically, it represents the fact, the vertical arm of the cross represents for me the connection between God's transcendence and God's immanence, the utterly ineffable, inarticulatable mystery, which is God, and the manifest realms through which he kinds of, you know, creates. And so for me, that's what the vertical arm of the cross represents. And the horizontal arm represents our oneness with all life forms, all sentient beings throughout the cosmos, what Native American Indians will call all my relations. And then the intersection point where they meet, that's the notion of the individual self on safari, the individual incarnated self, or the mission self. And then for me, the cross of resurrection is the reality that those who had real encounters with Jesus after his resurrection are trying to kind of fish around for ideas to try to convince their audiences that it really was he. But at the same time, he was radically transformed. So how do you hold those 2 ideas at the same time? So you have what are called the before-after images that you find in the Bible, and the below-above images. So the before-after are like the horizontal arm of the cross of resurrection, and the below-above are the vertical arm of the cross of resurrection. So what do I mean by before-after? They're trying to tell people, look, it really was he. He was the same before and after. He ate fish with us. He showed us his hands and his feet. We could see where the nail prints were. So it really was the same Jesus. We weren't being fooled. But at the same time, there was something very different about him. We didn't recognize him at first. 2 people walked on the road to Emmaus with him and didn't recognize him until he started celebrating Eucharist in a little hotel. He was able to walk through walls, appear and disappear. There's quantum tunneling. He'd figured out quantum tunneling already. So already he's transformed as well. So you have to hold these 2 pieces together. It is the same Jesus, but he's radically different in some ways. And then just a few concluding remarks. I went on to suggest that this last week in the life of Jesus was simply a week-long fractal of a 3-year career. So he managed to kind of telescope 3 years of ministry into this one last week of life. But even that 3-year career, I believe, was a fractal of his entire life of preparation. From the time he was birthed by his mother until he says to his father, "Daddy, hug me," the entire life, in some sense, was a fractal. And I think it was a fractal of the human condition, the entire history of humanity since the arrival of Homo sapiens sapiens on the planet. And so it's a fractal within a fractal within a fractal, which is what I would call this homily, Jesus as a fractal of history, but also as a prototype of the future. Because Jesus was able to harvest every aspect of his life, from his birth to his death, for its spiritual possibilities. And it wasn't just his death per se, but the entire life commitment to the mission. That's what the prototype is about. It's not that Jesus is asking us to focus on the cross of crucifixion or on his death, or that in some way this was especially salvific. It was only salvific insofar as everything he did in his life was salvific, because he harvested everything up to his dying breath. He harvested everything to serve his mission. I've suggested to you many times that there are 4 great questions we need to ask ourselves when we're attempting to create a personal cosmology. And those 4 questions are: who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? And if I were to put in one phrase, how Jesus answered these questions, I would say that Jesus was a man who never forgot who God is, who never forgot who himself was, who never forgot who his neighbor was, and who never forgot what his mission is. Unfortunately, both triumph and tragedy bring out the best and the worst in all of us. And we've seen this ourselves in the pandemic. And so when you look at all the characters, you see them all appearing in their true colors. You see who the priests really are in this period of history. You see who Pilate was. You see who Herod was. You see what the mob was, who the soldiers were, who the 12 were, and who Judas was. At the same time, you see who Veronica was. You see who his mother was. You see who the Magdalene was, and you see how John was. So with ourselves, it's the very, very same thing as well. Because sandwiched between the celebration of the Seder and the celebration of the resurrection, you have Gethsemane and you've got Golgotha, the cross. Now, this is true for not just Jesus, but for every one of us. Between birth and resurrection, there's a Garden of Gethsemane for all of us, and there's a crucifixions for all of us. The question is, what defines us? Was Jesus defined by his crucifixion or by his resurrection? And what defines our community? Is it crucifixion or is it resurrection? And when you think about your own journey and you contemplate the safari, your incarnational safari, what defines you? Crucifixion or resurrection? Namaste, my brothers and sisters. Let's open up at this stage to Q&A.
I was connecting the Jonah in the belly of the whale to the story of the last few days of Christ's life, and I was wondering if his the struggle between his divine will and human will in the Garden of Gethsemane was his trip into the belly of the whale, not the descending into hell after he was put in the tomb, because at that point he was already fully realized and enlightened and with God. And then I also was reminded of what we're taught as young and impressionable Catholics, that Jesus was going down there to save all those souls that had died for thousands of years before that, but couldn't get to heaven until Jesus died, was resurrected, which never made any sense to me. I guess they're all hanging out in limbo or purgatory or something.
Great questions, Tom. So let me deal with them in the order in which you asked them. The first thing is the Jonah story. It comes from about 600 BCE, and it's a beautiful story. Actually, it's a little bit earlier than that. Actually, it's about the 7th century BCE. And the story behind it, as you know, very briefly, is that God is asking Jonah to go and preach to the Assyrians in Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of the great Assyrian Empire, which actually conquered the 10 tribes of Israel in the year 722 BCE. And so they're arch enemies. And at the same time, God is asking Jonah to go and ask him to repent. And Jonah won't have any of it. So Jonah gets on a boat and he sails as far away from God as he could. He goes right across the Mediterranean. He's heading for Spain. He's trying to get as far away as he can. And then you know the story, there's a storm, you know, and he volunteers to be thrown overboard because he thinks it's his fault. And there's a whale, you know, swallows him and then spits him up in the ocean and back in Israel. And then God says to him, are you now going to go? So it's the reluctant prophet again and again. Now, the big difference between, it's a beautiful metaphor that it's being spit out of the belly of the whale, you know, as Richard Ward said, did it very, very powerfully in the readings today. So it's a beautiful metaphor for being able to encounter the darkness, you know, and be ready to be spit out onto the beach of truth. Now, unfortunately, the end of the story is very different. There's a huge difference between Jonah and Jesus. Jonah finally reluctantly agrees to go to Nineveh, you know, and to preach 40 more days, and Nineveh, the great city, is going to be destroyed. So he goes into the middle of this huge city, and we are told it's a city of a population of 120,000 people. And he goes into the middle and he says, 40 more days and Nineveh, the great city, is going to be destroyed. And people start listening, and somebody goes to the king and says, there's this Jewish prophet who says 40 more days and Nineveh is going to be destroyed. What are we going to do? And the king orders everybody to go into sackcloth and ashes to see if God can change his mind. So Jonah withdraws from the city, and he's sitting on a hilltop waiting for the fireworks. And he's sitting under a kind of a big plant, which is affording him shelter from the sun. And all of a sudden, the plant begins to wither. And Jonah gets really mad with God. He says, why did you do that? That's the only shade I had, and you destroyed it. And God says to Jonah, you're upset because I destroyed a single plant that you didn't put in the ground and you didn't grow, but you want me to kill 120,000 people, not to mention the cattle. You're okay with that? And so at the very end, Jonah is really upset that God made a fool of him. That Jonah preached something and prophesied something that didn't happen because the people repented, you know, and changed. Now that's the huge difference between the Jesus story and the Jonah story. That Jesus is the real prophet is not somebody who's trying to predict the future, but to prevent the future. And Jonah didn't get that. The real prophets are those who try to stop us from going where we're headed, and they're really happy when it happens. But Jonah hadn't reached that place as well. So that's an answer to the first question. The second piece then, I totally agree with you. We had this notion that Jesus had to go down into the underworld to set free everybody from Adam right down through human history who were locked up in some kind of a holding mechanism until they were set free. Now, talk about a ludicrous notion. And Jesus dispels that even as he's dying. When he says to the good thief, you know, today you will be with me in paradise. There is no time. St. Peter, in one of his letters, says, in the eyes of God, 1,000 years and a single day are the same thing. So we step out of time. So this notion that, you know, that souls are in a holding position for eons of time until Jesus actually physically died and went down and he had the key and he said, okay, guys, you're free to go back up. And that's a totally ludicrous fundamentalist notion that Roman Catholicism visited on you and on me and on many of us. So, great questions.
About the cross, I've been thinking about that image of the cross, and so I understand the horizontal axis is sort of our connection to one another, our connection to all. But can you explain the vertical?
So the vertical arm of the cross represents the connection between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. So of the transcendence of God, we can say nothing, absolutely nothing. It is ineffable and it is inarticulatable. Nobody has ever been able to explain who God is, nor can we even try. That does not mean that we can't experience it. We can experience it. Any mystical encounter is an encounter with the ineffability of God. But there is a connection because this ineffable source of all that is manifested through all of creation, through trillions of galaxies, you know, through all kinds of plant and flora and fauna. So everything that exists in some senses is an articulation of the divine, expressing herself. So there has to be a connection between these two pieces. And I've said to you many times that is the difference between prayer and meditation. Prayer is the immanence of God initiating a dialogue with the transcendence of God. And meditation is a dialogue initiated by the transcendence of God, in order to communicate with the immanence of God. So we start the prayer, God starts meditation. All meditation starts with transcendence, and all time starts with immanence.
I found it wonderful that you were talking about how Jesus' descent into hell was actually bringing light into the lower realms. I'd never heard that before. And helping the souls that were there. And you have also talked about when you sleep that you are going to those realms and helping. And this has to do, to me, with service. I'm now kind of confused about, is that sort of what the Catholic Church used to call purgatory? But if that does exist, what are the things that you do to help, and what can we do to help and be of service to the souls who are in these places?
That's a great question, Joanna. And so there's mingling of many, many different wisdom traditions here. And so, for instance, in modern kind of transpersonal theology, it talks about, the lower astral realms. So when you sleep at night and your consciousness shifts out of your physical body, there's only a tiny bit of the energy left in the system to make sure your heart is working and your brain is working and your kidneys are working. So we retain a portion of the energy, but a lot of it goes beyond the etheric into the astral. And the astral body is the place where our emotions reside. It's the place we go when we dream. And it is the archive of all of the experiences of the incarnation just ended, when you finally die and you shuffle off this mortal coil. All of the experiences you generated in the incarnation just finished, according to Judaism, are archived in the astral body to be picked up again on the way back down in your next incarnation. But in that astral plane, time and space do not exist. So for instance, I've said this example many times. I have a dream of my grandfather in my home from 1956, back in Ireland. So in the blink of an eye, when I fall asleep and I dream, I've gone 6,000 miles to the east, and I've gone 70 years back in time, because there is no time and there is no space at the astral level. Now, the thing is, as we're moving into higher realms, going beyond the astral, up into the mental, psychic, soul bodies, it's like traveling through the asteroid belt. If you're sending, for instance, a probe to investigate Jupiter, at some stage, you're going to have to go through the asteroid belt, which is millions of fragments of a planet that exploded in the past. And it is very, very dangerous, because if you encounter one of those, it's lights out. And so there's the equivalent, in some senses, at an energetic level. You might call it kind of a meteorite belt, or a kind of a belt of loose rocks, except it's at an energy level. And these are what Buddhism will sometimes call hungry ghosts, that there are people who died, whose souls are released to go back to source, but they're racked with anxiety or fear or addiction. And so they're hanging around in the lower astral plane, and they're looking for people to indulge their addictions. So they'll hang around pubs, or they'll hang around addicts of various kinds, because they need a physical body in order to experience their addiction. Or they, died in horrific circumstances where they were involved in killing people in a war situation, and they're discombobulated and they're lost, and they don't know how to focus on the light. Now, I think in some senses, maybe that's what purgatory was about. Maybe in some kind of a convoluted fashion, this is what the Catholic Church was trying to explain, however badly they did it. Now, on a personal level, years and years and years ago, I made a commitment to myself that when I was dreaming at night, I would try to be of assistance to discombobulated entities who are lost. But my prayer was, don't get me into quote unquote crap that I can't handle. You know what my abilities are. I don't want to kind of pretend to be better than I am. So assign me some lost soul that I can handle. Don't give me something that I can't handle. And so it's a kind of a voluntary prayer I make before I go to sleep at night. Let me be of benefit to some souls, in that place, but make sure I'm not out of my depth in this place. But before I do that, obviously, I have to protect myself. I have to make sure that I'm surrounded, with white light, and with my angel guardians, and with Archangel Michael, or with particularly Mary, Mother Mary. And so I want to know that when I'm journeying there, I'm being protected, and I'm also trying to be of assistance. It's like Jesus sending out his 12 disciples and then 72. Yeah, but they need some kind of training, and some kind of protection, and they need to come back home and debrief. So in some senses, that's what I have in mind here. And different systems will call it different things. Buddhism would call them, when they talk about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they talk about them as hungry ghosts, and in psychology, very often, transpersonal psychology, they talk about discombobulated entities who have kind of lost their way between incarnation and source, and they're in there in the middle, in turmoil and anxiety.
So if we don't want to do that in our sleep, we can just consciously pray.
Absolutely. Praying for whatever version of it you subscribe to, that there are certainly beings who have passed on, who are not fully free, who haven't embraced the light or moved towards light, and pray for them. Say a rosary, whatever you want to do, and make that the focus.
My question is not to insult any particular gender, but when you were talking about, do you choose crucifixion or do you choose resurrection? It occurred to me that, at least in the scriptures, that the male followers were very fearful and hiding right before, during, and after the crucifixion, where the female followers were able to be free and go and participate and be there for him afterwards without any fear of persecution or retribution or anything like that. So I'm just wondering, was that because of the times that women were not taken seriously enough to go after, and the men were because they had more power, women were not powerful, or did it have something to do with their choice?
Brilliant question, Susie. And I think it's a mixture of several factors. I think, and I can't verify this historically, but I would imagine that was almost unheard of for a woman to be crucified. And it's interesting, the Romans did not invent crucifixion. It was the Persians who invented crucifixion. The Romans picked up on it. And indeed, Judaism picked up on it during a period of Jewish history when they were temporarily free, between after the Maccabean revolt, which was about 170 BCE, and the arrival of the Romans in 70 BCE. There was an internal conflict going on in Israel between two brothers, both of them who wanted to be both high priest and king of Israel. And they employed crucifixion. These two brothers employed crucifixion to get at each other. So it wasn't invented by the Romans, it was invented by the Persians. But I would be very surprised to learn that any woman was crucified. There may have been exceptions, I don't know of them, but certainly it would not have been the norm. And so in some senses, women didn't have the fear that they would be punished in that particular form. So that's one piece of it. The other thing is, there's something about the feminine face of God embodied in the female body, that women have the ability to conceive and to carry, to birth and to nurture in a way that men don't. That men's contribution to kind of procreation, is an orgasm, lasting, 5-6 minutes or whatever. And so I'm not saying that fathers haven't been dedicated to raising their family. And in fact, but the male kind of contribution to the protection of the family was sourcing food and protecting against the enemies. And for that, they were prepared to shed their blood. And so in some senses, the male version of, sustaining a family was being prepared to die, put your life on the line for the family, or kill on behalf of the tribe. So there were very, very different kinds of vocations for which the two bodies, were equipped. The male body is equipped very, very differently from the female body when it comes to, feats of physical endurance or fighting. And the female body is equipped very, very differently from the male when it comes to conceiving and carrying and nurturing and in that sense. So in some senses, there's not the same pressure on the women of Jesus' time that there was on the men. I mean, if these guys had been captured in the garden with Jesus, it's very possible that instead of 3 people being crucified that day on Golgotha, there would have been 15 people crucified on Golgotha. Very, very possible. Not just a probability, but a real possibility, real probability. And so you have many, many factors in there. So I think it behooves us then to look at, what do we contribute in our spacesuits? How are we equipped in either a female spacesuit or a male spacesuit to conceive God, to carry God, to birth God, and to nurture God? And we need to I think we need to transcend in some senses and go into the notion of yin and yang, that there are energy forms which are called upon in various circumstances. So I constantly think of this issue where a situation where a 25-year-old woman comes across a car accident in which a truck has overturned and there's another person pinned under it, a 1.5-ton truck, and there's nobody around to help. And what does she do? She lifted a 1.5-ton truck off this, and there's a woman and a child trapped underneath. And then she crashed a little baby and she holds it to her breast. So here's a woman who's, flipping, appropriately from yang energy, pulling a 1.5 ton truck off somebody, and a yin energy cradling a little baby. So each of us, has both yin and yang energies. And I gave an entire retreat a few years ago about transcending, gender and going beyond male and female into the notion of yin and yang and the appropriate meeting of those. And sometimes the appropriate distribution, is that men will be given some kind of tasks and women other tasks. Sometimes as part of a team, that one member of the team will do more kind of yang activity and the other person do more yin. And sometimes we're called upon to manifest both of them within the same character, within the same spacesuit. When is it appropriate for me to go into yin mode? And when is it appropriate to go into yang modes? So I love little children. And so I say it's interesting when Arlen and I go into town in Hillsburg, and she's oohing and awing about every dog and every cat that she encounters. And I'm oohing and awing about every little baby that I see. And so there's something about little infants that bring out the yin energy in me. And there are other situations, obviously, like there's a tree drawn across my road and I have to get out and I bring up my chainsaw. So it's more yang energy. So for me, it's moving into the next phase is going to move into the realization that, that we are both the female and the male aspects of the divine. And that once we incorporate that reality into our own psyches, into our own souls, maybe we will transcend, we won't need even physical bodies anymore in order to kind of illustrate or articulate or manifest these two aspects of the divine.
I don't really have a question so much as a comment or a very, very brief story. It'll harken back to Johanna's question. So a week ago, yesterday, when we were making preparations on Easter Eve for sunrise service, and Robbie was here and Bill and Sharon, and I was surrounded by love and light, and it was the most wonderful feeling. And I went to bed ready to get up and celebrate Easter. And just before it was time to get up, I had one of the most horrific dreams I've ever had. And I didn't know what to make of it until I heard your homily today. And I just want to briefly share. In my dream, I saw and smelled and heard horrific evil. And I was outside of it, passively observing. And I saw evil enter little children, and I just watched it. And then I saw my mother, who was kind of white and moving slowly, and she was moving towards this place. And I called to her and I said, "Oh, no, you can't go in there. It's not safe." And she just slowly walked straight through the wall and straight inside. And so I'm reminded today from your homily that it's one thing to be awake. Maybe that's level 1.
Yes.
Level 2, maybe once we can see things that we couldn't see before and realize things we didn't realize before, there's a fear and a desire to avoid or hide. Stay safe.
Yes.
But what I'm driven to remark about here is that we need to walk towards it. And like you said, shed light and not passively watch.
Right.
And that you'll be safe.
Yes.
We'll be protected. We should go give light.
Right. That's a powerful, powerful image. It feels to me, Marie, that in some senses, you had a kind of an overnight fractal of the life of Jesus and the life of planet Earth. So in the short period of time when you had that dream, that you're walking through death and the underworld into resurrection, and that you celebrate the next day, and that in some senses, every one of us is called upon to engage in a similar safari, whether it's concentrated into a brief period of time or extended over an entire lifetime. And so it becomes really important then, when we do wake up, we're going to see the evil. We're going to see what's, out of kilter. But we then need to not just shed light on it, we need in some sense, insofar as we're called upon it, to confront that and to make sure that it's extirpated from the system, that little kids are not being exposed to this. I mean, that is my definition of original sin. Original sin is not the sin because parents conceived a child, through concupiscence, in a kind of an out of, an irrational orgasm, as Augustine taught, but rather that sin is the inherited world that children are born into because of the choices adults have been making for 200,000 years. And that part of our job is to identify that, confront it, shed light on it, but ultimately to believe that this is God's gig. Ultimately, I've said this many times, that there are 4 kinds of levels of compassion. The first level of compassion is kind of neurological, and you're an expert in this, that there are literally mirror neurons in the brain that can kind of appreciate the suffering they're watching in another. Literally, that there are areas of the brain that light up when we're watching somebody suffering. So mirror neurons. So there's a neurological dimension. The next one is a kind of an emotional dimension, that my heart is paining for those that I see suffering. The third level is sociological compassion, where I try to intervene and ameliorate a situation for somebody who's in distress, whether it's feeding the homeless, rescuing an animal caught in a snare, or whatever it is. So that's sociological. And the fourth one is mystical, the realization that this is God's gig, that, people have volunteered for incarnation. Ultimately, every one of us is going to find our way home. And so when I've done everything I can do, I have to kind of back out of it and say, okay, over to you, God, you make the next move. I'm going to do what I can do, but it's not for me to solve this problem completely. I know I can do what I can do. It's a powerful dream. So it feels like it'd be a half-hour fractal of the entire life of Jesus. Yeah, beautiful. Right. Namaste.
I have a question from chat. It's about the Sarx and Pneuma that is used interchangeably throughout John 3. You must be born again of the flesh and the spirit, born again, water and of blood. Could you please unpack your interpretation of John 3?
Thank you, Trish. Yeah, I will. And so in some sense, this was a conversation that Jesus was having with a guy called Nicodemus, who was part of the Sanhedrin, but he was a secret, disciple of Jesus. And he's embarrassed to come to Jesus in full daylight. So he comes to him secretly. And Jesus uses this famous phrase, you must be born again of the flesh and of spirit. The flesh is Sarx, obviously. In other words, you're agreeing to incarnation. And so you are being born of the flesh. Your physical body is Sarx, but you're also born of spirit, because the realization is you're a spirit in a space suit. And so when you move through life realizing that this is a vehicle that you need in order to experience incarnation, then you honor it, but you do not identify with it. So if Jesus were speaking to a Buddhist audience, he would have talked about Turiya and Turiyatita instead of Sarx and Pneuma. He would have said in Buddhism, the word Turiya represents the witnessing consciousness. When you step outside of your identification with yourself and you just watch as a soul what your incarnated body is doing, then you're in Turiya. But there's Turiyatita, which is even better, according to Buddhism, and that is that at the same time that you're in your witnessing consciousness, you're also participating in life as an incarnated being. And so you're walking with both feet. You're not identifying, you're in incarnation, you're participating in it, but you're not identifying your essence with it. It's like the term I've used many times is like in cultural anthropology, they talk about the participant observer. There was this ridiculous notion in early cultural anthropology that a white person could go into the Amazon jungle, sneak into a village and watch the natives doing their shtick, and then that would take copious notes and tell you, what their everyday life was. I tell you that 3 years before that guy went to the Amazon, the people in the Amazon knew he was coming because they were in dream time. They were already told, there's this dude coming, here's what he looked like. And so the notion that you could just watch the natives doing what they're doing and not in any way influence it is ludicrous. So you're a participant observer. You're participating because you're changing what's happening right there. And the same thing is true, with the Sarx and the Pneuma, that you're Sarx, therefore you're incarnated, and therefore you have to walk that journey to the best of your ability. You have to play the character that you signed up to play in this incarnation, but you can't identify with that. You have to identify with the source self, with the Pneuma. So you're walking with Sarx and Soma, with water and blood. And again, for the Judaism, water represents physical life. nurturance. Blood represented what belonged to God. And that's why in Judaism, you couldn't eat any products with meat in it. And it's interesting that when the young Jesus movement started, and there are a lot of converts to Judaism coming from the Gentile world, and the first council of Jerusalem is held, the first council of the church is held in Jerusalem in 49 AD. And there's only one question on the agenda. Paul says, I've converted a whole bunch of Gentiles. Now, I need you, Peter and James and John, to tell me, do they have to become Jews in order to become Christians, followers of Jesus? Do they have to get circumcised if they're men? Do they have to keep all 613 precepts of the law before I can baptize them, as members of the Jesus movement? And there's a big, big discussion. And finally, James gives the decision. James is the brother of Jesus, and James is in charge. And James says, we've heard John talk, we've heard Paul talk. It is my decision. He's in charge. And he says, we should not exact anything from the Gentile audience except 4 things. And the 4 things have to do, all of them have to do with blood. They're not allowed to eat anything with blood in it. They're not allowed to eat the meat of strangled animals, because when you strangle an animal, the blood remains in it. They're not allowed to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols, because the blood is poured out to the idol. So, and they should not engage in, and the Greek term that's used is porneia, which is often mistranslated as you kind of pornography or fornication. It does not mean that. Porneia in Greek originally meant marriage within the forbidden bloodline. You can't marry a sibling. And so all 4 injunctions have to do with blood, because blood represented the divinity and water represented humanity. So the 2 images that he's using, blood and water, and Sarx and Pneuma, have to do with this dance between spirit and matter. Great question, Trish.
I think something that always kind of was a question mark in my mind when reading about Jesus going into the lower world before he was resurrected. It's like it just suddenly hit me that that's kind of the way the cross is made. It's like there's the middle world and the lower world, and then the transcendent world. And then it hit me that my own journey started with, when I was 15, I entered the lower world really big time. And I quit school, I quit church, I quit my family. I just checked out and went really, really low. And I had guidance all the time, thankfully, though I didn't know it. But I'm wondering if each of our experience isn't, as we get to know what the Christ is and what our relationship to the divine is, if we too kind of go through this process that Jesus went through. I don't know, what might be your thoughts?
It's great question. And so I kind of oriented towards your own history, because your husband was a Native American Indian. And so you're steeped in this. And in Native American Indian lore and in Aboriginal peoples all over the world, as in my Celtic mythology, in the ancient Celtic mythology before Christianity arrived, there are 3 levels to reality: the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. And a shaman in the Peruvian forest or any place else, the function of the shaman is to be able to move seamlessly between these 3 worlds. And particularly if there is sickness or illness of any kind, the function of the shaman is to visit where the soul is trapped and to go down into the underworld and to try to rescue the soul of the living person and restore it, so that the person can kind of get through whatever physical or mental distress they're in the middle world. We have the very, very same thing in Celtic mythology. The upper realms had to do with what we call the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, had to do with gods and goddesses. The middle world had to do with us humans, and the lower world had to do with our ancestors who had gone before us. So it's this connection between the 3 realms. And everywhere you find a shamanistic culture, you find these three levels of it. And so the cross portrays that beautifully, because the cross is embedded in the lower world. The foot of the cross is interesting that if it were not embedded in the lower world, it wouldn't have stability. It would tip over. You couldn't just stand it up. It would fall over. So in some senses, it's interesting that it seems to be even a part of the mission that unless we're grounded somehow in the lower world and we're able to kind of visit it and transcend it and go beyond it, in the very same way that you take an oak tree. You know, the oak tree has this extraordinary underground system, and it's almost like a mirror image of what appears above the ground. If you were to place a mirror on the ground and kind of reflect what the root system of a tree looks like and what the branches of a tree look like, they're almost mirror images, and they're assisting each other. It's not just that the root system is providing nutrients, you know, to the branches and to the leaves. The leaves, through chlorophyll and photosynthesis, are providing energy that goes right down into the root system. So they're feeding each other. So in some senses, you know, these three worlds represent a kind of an epigenetic model of evolution. Epigenesis means that every subsequent stage builds upon, you know, but transcends all previous stages. And so I think, yes, that Jesus as a shaman is visiting, you know, retrieving the lost souls, in the sense that there are people who get stuck in the underworld, who don't know how to move between the three realms, and these need to be freed. There are other people, you know, heavenly beings, who are afraid to incarnate. I think, you know, Earth mission is one of the scariest rides in the cosmos. It takes real brave souls to say, send me, I'll volunteer for planet Earth. And when there's a statement that Jesus made one time that I like to change a little bit. He said, there's more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 who do not need repentance. What I said is that there's more joy in heaven about one soul who volunteers to incarnate on planet Earth than 99 souls who says, no, I'll pass on this one. Yeah, no, I'm grand here. Fine, thank you. Thanks for asking. And so the courage to visit all the realms, that's hugely important. And so, yeah, the cross represents that connection between all three realms.
My ideas about what happens after we're done here in the boot camp of the universe have been changing. And recently, I've gone from this idea of thinking like our personality and our ego, it all ends when we're done here. Then you touched on something in response to a question earlier, and also last week, we were talking about this idea that after our life here, some, if you weren't reborn, let's say you didn't fully realize your mission, you get stuck. You don't really make it home. And it almost sounds like your personality, your ego, your struggles from your time here, they stay with you if you're not able to work through them. And it sounds, when I think about it, I'm like, oh, I guess that's just karma, you know, and then maybe you have to keep working through it. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the ego and the personality, and how would that sort of be left, but the struggles, the unresolved business, the getting lost here and staying lost after here.
I got some great questions mixed in together there, Derek. We have to kind of define what we mean by ego and self, because different psychological systems use these words very, very differently. So the given wisdom in psychology, you know, mainstream psychology, is that personality is an artifact of nature and nurture. And some people, like the behavioralists, believe it's completely nurture, that we come in tabula rasa, empty slates, and it's how we're treated that determines what kind of a personality will emerge. So you can literally create any being you want, depending on how you raise a child. So that's where the focus is completely on nurture, that you come in, there's nothing on the blackboard, you write, you know, your teachers or your parents write what they want you to be. There's another version that says, no, it's nature. You come here already predisposed, you know, and you have very little control over what happens. And then in the middle ground, they say, well, it's some kind of a trade-off between nature and nurture. I see it very differently. I see that there are three factors involved in it. There's nature and nurture, but by far the most important one is the soul that comes in. And so it's been my experience that you can take a very old soul and put it into a highly dysfunctional family, into actually a physically crippled body, and the soul will shine anyway. They'll become a beautiful person. You can take a very young soul and put it into a perfect family, you know, into a healthy athletic body, and it'll screw up anyway. It's having to do with, you know, at what stage the soul is at. Personality is the interface between essence and the environment in which it finds itself, you know, or, you know, between the soul and the environment in which the soul finds itself. So you can take the same soul and put it into very different, you know, environments, and a different aspect of soul will emerge. And so when we die, for instance, and the ego per se is gone, because the ego was simply the manifestation of a soul in a particular kind of environment. The incarnation I had of Seán ÓLaoire and the family I came from, there was a particular ego that needed to evolve and a particular personality that needed to emerge because of those circumstances. Now that I'm, on the way up, I carry vestiges of that with me. So having been around enough people who transitioned, what I've seen is that people tend to die the way they lived. People don't have radical kind of transformations at the moment of it. So we tend to die the way we live. I think we tend to transition the way we die. I think we tend to find ourselves on the other side, in the manner in which we transitioned. But that's not a final state. That's growing. So that continues to evolve. So I believe that there are healing modalities on the other side that are dealing with traumatized souls, who've quote unquote blown it in the most recent incarnation and need to be healed in some way. So it's like healing spas, and that there are mentors and angelic beings whose very function is to take these souls, and heal them so they can continue with their journey. Now, but there are some recalcitrant, souls who won't do that. No matter where they're being asked to go, they won't go. They're stuck, And so what happens? We have to realize, firstly, that time is an artifact of incarnation, and that what looks like forever, never to kind of liberate themselves is a blinking in an eye, and that eventually everybody goes home. Every single soul, including Satan, goes home to God, because everything came from God. And evil is just an emergent phenomenon. It was not built into the system, as a prerequisite. It was an emergent phenomenon. And so there is nobody who will be separated from God finally. You can be no more separated from source than a sunbeam can be separated from the sun. So when ultimately all souls are fully awake, and have gone back to source, then God folds up the game. The game is over, and she creates a brand new game. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but at some stage, everybody figured out what the rules of the game were. Everybody kind of won at Monopoly or whatever, won at chess, whatever it is. Everybody won. And so there's no point in playing the game anymore. There are no losers left. So now you can end that kind of game and begin another one.